So I'd like to talk about this movie, Lars and the Real Girl. Now, this is a movie from 2007, so it's 16 years old now at the time that I'm filming this. But I think there are some interesting aspects of the movie that make it interesting to kind of reflect on now that a few years have passed. If you haven't seen it, you can see it for free on Tubi. This isn't a sponsored video, but there are ways that you can see the movie online for free. And I would recommend this movie. I think it's a good movie to watch. So if it's important for you to not have this experience spoiled, then here's your spoiler warning. Go see the movie and come back if that's an important part of your experience of films. I don't personally mind having films spoiled, but if that's important to you, turn back now before I give away anything in the plot. So this review is going to be sort of divided into two different parts. The first part I'm going to talk about sort of little observations that I have about the film. And the second part I'm going to talk about how this movie is an interesting reflection on society and also an interesting reflection on filmmaking. And I think now that some time has passed since this film has come out, it's interesting to sort of see what reflections the movie has on on us as humans, on our society, and also the way that films are made. I think you really couldn't make a movie like this if you were to make a movie right now. So, all right, so here are some observations that I have about the movie. First of all, it's a great film. I think it's a very sweet tale. There are definitely a lot of ways that this movie could have been more bawdy. There could have been a lot of jokes about a sex doll who appears in the movie. So I think this could have been a movie that would have been very jokey and hacky, but it was treated with a very delicate touch. And I think the direction and the screenwriting in the movie really deserves some kind mentions because they didn't go in any direction that was, making sex jokes and stuff. There's very, very little of that in the movie. And when it's done, I think it's done in a way that's tonally appropriate. There are some interesting literary features in the movie, like there are some nods to Don Quixote. Don Quixote, of course, was a story with a delusion. In this movie, Ryan Gosling plays a character who has this delusion that this hunk of silicon that is essentially a sex doll is actually a real woman that he's having a relationship with. So there's some interesting parallels, and some of those parallels are echoed by little nods in the movie, and I thought that was interesting and creative. Ryan Gosling has a really interesting portrayal in this movie. And if you've seen a lot of Ryan Gosling's work, I think you can look at this movie and see that this is a really stellar example of his acting skill. He's really acting in a way that's out of the type that he's been cast as in most of the movies that he's been in. So his acting is really very interesting and very flawed and very human, and I think it's even very relatable, although he portrays a character who's really awkward. Emily Mortimer plays Ryan Gosling's or Lars's sister-in-law in the movie. I think her portrayal is really emotional, very moving, and really very compelling. If you're into movie trivia, there are some interesting things behind the scenes in this movie. For instance, when they had this sex doll in the movie, and I say sex doll because I'm not sure there's another great term for what she is in real life. But she was treated like a real actor. She was treated like a real person. I think that's kind of an interesting reflection. And she actually didn't have any, she was not anatomically correct. They kind of make some brief jokes about that in the movie. The doll itself was not, an anatomically correct doll, interestingly. So she was, in some ways, treated like a human being. There are some interesting depictions of the medical condition of hyperesthesia. Lars is sort of an awkward character, and one of the things that he exhibits as a trait is, this hyperesthesia, where human touch is very painful and very difficult for him to bear. So that was sort of an interesting character trait, and I think it's portrayed accurately and also sensitively and really well in the movie. It's not a perfect movie. There's a romantic character in the movie played by Kelly Garner, and the actor does a really great depiction, by the way, of the role that she plays. But there are some missteps at the end of the movie. For instance, again, spoiler warning, but after the doll undergoes sort of a metaphorical death in the movie, Ryan Gosling's attention turns to Kelly Garner's character, Margot, in a way that's a little bit jarring. So it's not a perfect movie, but I think it's a really nice experience. So the main big observations that I have about the movie are the ways that it reflects our society. I think the ways that it will reflect changes in intimacy that will happen in the coming years. And I think there's also some interesting reflections on filmmaking. As I'm going to make clear in just a few moments, I think there are a lot of reasons why this is a great movie. It has some really nice features cinematically that I don't think you could do anymore these days. I think this is not the kind of movie that you could make anymore. Now, one of the reasons why I think it would be hard to make this movie right now is because I think in some ways, societally, we've become a little bit too cynical to see people in this very sweet light. If you kind of take the idea of people having delusions about inanimate objects being the objects of their affection, I think that's something that would be portrayed in a lot of negative ways in film right now. I also think that Hollywood right now, in the way that screenwriting is, would not be able to portray a character with this kind of sensitivity who has this behavior pattern. Now, what do I mean by that? Lars is awkward, he's isolated, and he has a relationship with an inanimate object. So there are obviously, some things about that behavior that would be flawed, and I don't think you could make a movie right now depicting Lars in a positive light. He's also very isolated, and he's also a very sympathetic character. And I think if you portrayed like sort of an incel type now, someone who's socially isolated, who's awkward, I think the portrayal would be really negative. In fact, I would go so far as to say that you could not portray a white male with this kind of a fragile state anymore in film. I just don't think that portrayal would come across. If you look at most big budget movies that have come out recently, a lot of them, the white male is often the villain in the story or often the really goofy comic relief character. And I think the humanity that the screen puts into the character Lars is really very nuanced, very interesting to watch. But it's also something that I think, Hollywood would not be able to tell that story right now, especially as flawed as it is to sort of depict a romantic relationship as a relationship between a male and an inanimate object female. That would be something that would be really difficult to tell a story about right now. There's another interesting reflection that I think this movie is prescient in some ways, and I think there will be some interesting reflections on this movie in the future. Now, what do I mean by that? I think we're really on the cusp of an era where artificial intelligence could really simulate human companionship in a lot of interesting ways. It's already happening right now. People already are developing romantic attachments to artificial intelligence in different ways, and people are looking towards artificial intelligence as companionship. Now, that's not always a bad thing. There's a really interesting study where AI bots are used to talk to people who are mentally ill as a way of providing companionship and as a way of sort of mitigating social isolation. I think those are really wonderful and important uses of artificial intelligence. But it will be interesting as that evolves to reflect back on this movie and to rethink it, because I think this movie is an interesting depiction of a relationship between a human and an inanimate object. There's another reason why I think it would be really hard to make this movie right now, and that is that I think as a society we've become too cynical with regards to isolation. This movie is set in a very small town. It's a very small community. It's an interesting setting for the movie. I don't think that you could have this movie happen in a big city. And as isolation becomes more prevalent in society, in the world, and certainly in the United States, as that isolation becomes a more prevalent reality of our lives, I don't know that I think the response that the community has to Lars in the movie may grow to seem really unrealistic. Lars is a really awkward character. He ignores people. There's this kind of common thing that happened as a trope of characters in the 90s and the aughts, where they would show a character, and even to some extent in the 80s, where they would show a character with a really redeeming character arc. But the character starts off as being somebody who's kind of a jerk, who's kind of an a-hole. And you can see that if Lars were a character in the real world, if he was a person that you met and you spoke with him and he totally ignored you, I think it would be hard for you to attach to Lars as a character. And I wonder if as society becomes more of an isolated place, I wonder if the experience that the community has around Lars in the movie will seem more and more unrealistic. Even though Lars is very awkward and ignores people and treats people in ways that are sometimes aloof and sometimes frankly unkind, the community that he's surrounded by really rallies around him to help him combat his isolation. And I think maybe that's one of the most heartwarming aspects of this movie. It's the way the community interacts with Lars. Now, I wish that this had been sussed out and developed just a little bit more in the movie. Again, it's a great film, but I do wish that there had been more emphasis on the reasons why the community came together around Lars to help him deal with his isolation. I think that could have been an interesting story. You know, our attitude towards mental illness on film is such that these days, I think you have to depict mental illness in ways that are very kind and very flattering on film. In reality, our societal attitude towards mental illness has evolved in the opposite direction since this movie came out. So nowadays, I think people with mental illness are much more isolated. I think even if you don't have any mental illness, you're much more isolated these days in society. So it will be interesting to watch as society kind of more shuns mental illness and as film seeks to portray mental illness in a more positive, less unflattering light. It'll be interesting to see how those dichotomies diverge. I think Lars's mental illness is treated in a way that is very humanizing in this movie. But in some ways, the movie does poke a little bit of fun at the delusions that he has. And I think that's something that if you were to make a movie now, that also, again, you wouldn't be able to get away with that kind of depiction. All right, so what do you think about the movie Lars and the Real Girl? I think it's a great movie. I think it's a little bit prescient of trends that may emerge as we deal more with artificial intelligence as a companion in our lives. I think it's an interesting depiction of social isolation. I think in some ways it's a bit of a jarring, unrealistic depiction of a community's response to somebody who's isolated. I wonder if there would be some way that could be made to be a more relating thing in the movie. So I think there are a lot of interesting observations and reflections about filmmaking that you could take in this movie, and a lot of interesting things about society. So if you haven't seen Lars and the Real Girl, check it out. If you have, let me know in the comments what you think of this movie. Do you think that this is a portrayal of a character that Hollywood could even produce nowadays? Is this a character whose, time has now gone from the genre of filmmaking? I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that. Whatever you think, let me know. Put your thoughts in the comments below. I'll read and respond to every single comment. Thanks, I'm really grateful for you tuning into this review.